I am presenting Union Gospel Presses Sunday School Lesson number 3, Sunday, September 18th, 2022. The lesson is entitled Promise of Obedience. Lesson text comes from Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 through 6, and chapter 24, verses 3 through 8. Related scriptures are Deuteronomy 5:22 through 29, Joshua 24:14 through 24, Jeremiah 7:21 through 29, Haggai 1:1 through 15. The place is Mount Sinai. The time is 1445 BC. In the past 2 weeks, we saw how God prepared his people through the provision of a leader, Moses, and the blood of a lamb. Today we look at how the people prepared themselves to follow him. Today's aim, facts, to examine God's covenant with the people of Israel and their response to his words. Principle, to show that as people of God, we are called to obey the words of God. Application, to demonstrate that when God speaks to us, he expects us as his children to obey him. Illustrating the lesson, when God calls us into covenant, we are called to obedience. Practical points. 1. God's faithfulness in our past gives us confidence to trust him for the present and the future. Exodus 19:1 through 4. 2. God has extravagant plans for those who remain faithful to him, verses 5 through 6. 3. It is easy to pledge fidelity to the Lord. Living it out is another matter, 24:3. 4. Worship is the appropriate response to hearing and receiving the word of God, verses 4 through 5. 5. God's covenant with us is sealed with blood, not of bulls, but of his precious and holy Son, verses 6 through 8. Golden text. Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord have said will we do. Exodus 24:3. Today we have 3 lesson outlines. The first is camp. Exodus 19:1 through 2. The second is contact. Exodus 19:3 through 6. The third is conformity. Exodus 24:3 through 8. Introduction. In our first lesson, we saw God's preparation for delivering his people from bondage by calling and commissioning Moses to lead them. Moses' obedience was hesitant, but God got him over his reluctance. In the second lesson, we saw him prepare his people through the instructions regarding the Passover lamb. This led directly to their rapid escape from Egypt, culminating in their dramatic deliverance from Pharaoh's army through the miraculous parting of the Red Sea. Now, a new chapter in the history of Israel was about to begin. As the Israelites camped in the wilderness before Mount Sinai, God called their leader Moses up onto the mountain to receive a promise and a covenant. It was Israel's responsibility to obey the covenant of law. The Israelites agreed to this requirement, and the appropriate burnt offerings and peace offerings were presented at the altar. Sacrificial blood was sprinkled by Moses. Camp. Exodus 19:1. In the 3rd month, when the children of Israel were gone forth out of the land of Egypt, the same day came they into the wilderness of Sinai. Verse 2, for they were departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai and had pitched in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mount. Deliverance 1, Exodus 19:1. As slaves in Egypt, the Israelites had been cruelly mistreated and had cried out to God for help. They needed a strong individual to plead their case before the Pharaoh. God had spent 40 years preparing a man named Moses out in the land of Midian to do this. As an adoptive son of an Egyptian princess, he knew the language and culture of Egypt as well as the language and culture of Israel. Moses was 80 years old by this time, and he had been a shepherd for his father-in-law. He had come out to the wilderness as a fugitive from Egyptian justice, and God had used those 4 decades to mature him. At the burning bush, God called him to go back to Egypt and lead his countrymen out of bondage. God had sent 10 devastating plagues upon Egypt to persuade the Egyptians to let his people go. Gifts were given to the Israelites, probably to speed them on their way out, thus allowing them to leave with great substance. When they were caught between a pursuing Egyptian army and the Red Sea, God opened up the water to let them through on dry ground and brought it back together to drown their pursuers. This great deliverance was accomplished by God's power alone. It was exactly 3 months after they left Egypt that the Israelites came into the wilderness of Sinai. This was strange territory to them, but it was familiar to Moses, who had spent 40 years shepherding flocks throughout this area. Deliverance 2, Exodus 19:2. The Israelites had journeyed from Rephidim to the west. There they had been confronted by the Amalekites and forced to defend themselves, evidently using weapons secured from the dead Egyptians. Once again, God granted them deliverance, but this time he gave them the skill and strength to accomplish it. A full account is given in 17:8-16. Moses led Israel from Rephidim to the desert or wilderness of Sinai. Camp was made at the foot of Mount Sinai, also known as Jebel Musa, one of 3 peaks in the range of mountains in the center of the southern Sinai Peninsula. There was a great plain there where the Israelites could pitch their tents. It was bare and isolated, but it gave Israel a place to rest and become better organized. More important, it was the place where God had chosen to speak to Moses and through him to all Israel regarding a national covenant. We call it the Mosaic Covenant or the Mosaic Law. Contact, verse 3. And Moses went up unto God, and the Lord called unto him out of the mountain, saying, Thus shalt thou say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, verse 4. Ye have seen what I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto me, unto myself, verse 5. Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine, verse 6. And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. Review, Exodus 19:3-4. Mount Sinai, or Mount Horeb, as it is sometimes called, was where God had spoken to Moses from the burning bush, chapters 3-4. Moses was not disappointed when he climbed up to spend time with God while Israel camped down below. The Lord called to him out of the mountain and told him he was to be his spokesman to the children of Israel. This put Moses into the position of a prophet. The first thing God told Moses to do when contacting his people was to review what God had done for them in releasing them from bondage. In recounting what had happened to their Egyptian taskmasters, Moses could remind his people of the 10 plagues used to punish them and force them to let their slaves go. He could remind them of how God had caused the pursuing Egyptians to drown in the Red Sea. He could remind them of how God gave Israel victory over the Amalekites. God likened his protective work to bearing Israel upon eagle's wings. This imagery may have reference to the Grafton vultures that were found in the area. When their floundering chicks were trying to learn how to fly, the parents would swoop under them and bear them up in midair, preventing them from falling to the ground and perishing. In like manner, the Lord was bringing the young nation of Israel to himself to be molded into maturity. Reward, Exodus 19:5-6. In light of what God had already done for Israel, it was expected that the nation would be grateful to him and ready to form a special relationship with him greater than anything experienced up to that point. God was saying to Israel that obedience to his voice and devotion to his covenant would cause the people to become a peculiar or special treasure to him above all the other people of the earth. All human beings belong to God by virtue of creation and his sustaining power. But the Israelites were God's chosen people, and they were to act accordingly. Israel's special relationship to God had nothing to do with ethnic superiority, intellectual capacity, or cultural refinement. It had everything to do with spiritual submission and development. Any advantages gained over other people were to be credited to the unique relationship between God and his chosen people. The form of government God had in mind for Israel might be called a theocratic monarchy. God was to be the Israelites' king, and they were to become a kingdom of priests, representing him and his righteousness to a sinful world. Any earthly judges, seers, prophets, or kings appointed by him were to operate under his guidance and direction. In this way, Israel was to be known as a holy nation set apart to God. This is a good place to take note of the fact that the Mosaic law was a schoolmaster designed to bring people to justifying faith in Jesus Christ, Galatians 3:24. Members of the church founded by Christ have been described in much the same way as the ancient Israelites. Ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar, precious, or special people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who have called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. 1 Peter 2:9. Central to the Mosaic covenant were the 10 commandments recorded in Exodus 20:1-17 and Deuteronomy 5:6-21. We recognize that these familiar commands express eternal principles and the character of God, even though in Christ we are not under the law as Israel was. Romans 6:14-15, Galatians 5:18. Conformity. Exodus 24:3. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord hath said will we do. Verse 4. And Moses wrote all the words of the Lord, and rose up early in the morning, and builded an altar under the hill, and 12 pillars according to the 12 tribes of Israel. Verse 5. And he sent young men of the children of Israel, which offered burnt offerings and sacrificed peace offerings of oxen unto the Lord. Verse 6. And Moses took half of the blood and put it in basins, and half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Verse 7. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord hath said will we do, and be obedient. Verse 8. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people, and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. Acceptance. Exodus 24:3. Moses had gone back up the mountain at the people's request. 20:18-21. The Lord gave him further revelation concerning the covenant. Then he told him to bring his brother Aaron and Nadab and Abihu and the 70 elders of Israel back up the mountain with him. However, only Moses himself was to approach the Lord's presence when they arrived there. 24:1-2. After coming down from the mountain, Moses told the people of Israel about all that God had said, including all the judgments, ordinances, commands designed to govern their lives. The people were unanimous in their declaration of acceptance. They promised that they would do all God said to do. It should be mentioned here that good intentions are often not carried out in actions. The Israelites soon strayed from their promise to be obedient to God's regulations. Exodus 32 describes the making of a golden calf to be used in pagan worship and an orgy of eating, drinking, and playing, probably sexual acts that accompanied it. During the 15th centuries, the Mosaic law was enforced. The people of Israel broke it many times and suffered divine discipline as a result. Altar. Exodus 24:4. Initially, however, the Israelites showed great enthusiasm toward God's covenant. As a result, Moses did two significant things. First, most likely using a roll or papyrus brought from Egypt, he wrote down all the words of the Lord. This may have indicated a very good memory on his part or divine help in remembering all of the details. Second thing Moses did was rise up early in the morning to build an altar and set up 12 stone pillars to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. These evidently were constructed in crude fashion from materials readily available in the wilderness. Moses was preparing for a ritual to ratify the covenant offered by God and accepted by Israel. It was to serve as a sealing ceremony for that contract. Offerings, Exodus 24:5-6. In the absence of an established order of priests, Moses appointed young men to perform sacrifices. He may have chosen one from each of the 12 tribes. They went into the flocks and selected animals to be used for burnt offerings and peace offerings. The first symbolized the people's dedication to God, while the second symbolized a proper spiritual relationship with God. The Bible contains numerous references to blood, especially as it was used in sacrifices. A concluding statement is found in Hebrews 9:22. Without shedding of blood is no remission, forgiveness of sin. Animal sacrifices served as a foreshadowing of the sacrifice performed by Christ at Calvary. Moses took blood from the sacrificial animals offered up by the young men and put half of it in basins to be set aside. The other half he sprinkled on the stone altar. This altar probably represented Yahweh in the covenant relationship between a holy God and sinful people, with the blood symbolizing God's forgiveness. The sacrifice of Christ on the cross provided a gateway for sinners to enter heaven. Obedience, Exodus 24:7-8. Moses next took the book scroll on which he had written down the words of the covenant given to him by God on Mount Sinai. This would have included the 10 Commandments, but it would also have listed the other regulations designated to govern the lives of the Israelites. Once again, the people were very agreeable to accept and perform all that God required of them. This must have been encouraging to Moses and other leaders of Israel. Unless God gave them the ability to foresee what would happen in the future, they might have thought that a golden age of spiritual development was about to dawn. In reality, there are always those who take detours from their good intentions. We are reminded of the parable of the sower told by Jesus and recorded in Matthew 13, Mark 4, and Luke 8. The seed of the gospel may fall by the wayside and be eaten by birds, fall upon stony places and not take root, grow but be withered by a scorching sun, fall among choking thorns, or fall into good ground and multiply many times over. Sometimes the righteous remnant that survives is fairly small. We might assume that Moses was optimistic about what Israel would do in relation to the covenant. He took the half of the sacrificial blood that had been reserved in basins and sprinkled it on the people. Since an estimated 2 to 3 million Israelites took part in the Exodus, it may well be that Moses actually sprinkled only the tribal leaders assembly directly in front of him. They represented the whole nation of Israel. This was a most solemn moment in the dedication ritual. If we turn to Genesis 9:3-6, we see that God made it clear to Noah and his family that life equals blood, and that whoever shed a man's blood would have his blood shed as well. Although the blood used by Moses in sprinkling was from animals, it filled a significant requirement in the dedication of the covenant. The uncountable sacrifices that would be offered up by succeeding priests in the implementation of the law in subsequent centuries would provide the symbolic basis for God's forgiveness of mankind's sin. Similarly, the blood Jesus shed on Calvary to provide an atonement for men's sin was God's requirement. It was absolutely necessary in the fulfillment of his redemptive plan. The old hymn by Robert Lowry puts it succinctly. What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Questions. 1. How old was Moses when he began his work of delivering Israel from bondage in Egypt? 2. Why was the Sinai desert familiar territory to Moses? 3. Where was Mount Sinai located on the Sinai Peninsula? 4. To what did God compare himself in caring for young Israel? 5. What synonym might be used for peculiar when referring to God's people? Exodus 19:5. 6. What kind of government did God propose for Israel? 7. How did the Israelites react to God's covenant requirements? 8. How did Moses use stones to set up a dedication ritual? 9. What two kinds of sacrifices were offered to God? 10. How did Moses use blood in the dedication ceremony? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, September 18, 2022. Thank you for listening. God bless.